This is an AQA Psychology A-level revision video for the paper 1 topic of psychopathology with a specific focus on the characteristics of depression. So to get started, let's have a look and make sure we are confident with where the characteristics of depression sit on the specification and how they fit into the big picture. So you are expected to know the behavioural, emotional and cognitive characteristics of depression, as well as phobias and OCD. So this video is focusing on the characteristics of depression. So in order to be able to explain the characteristics of depression, you need to be able to know what depression is. And depression is a mood disorder. Now, a mood disorder is the term that's used to explain disorders that affect the emotional state of a person, hence the word mood. And typically it's to do with the whole disorder because the mood is something that is distorted or inappropriate to a specific circumstance. So clinical depression is not to be mistaken for sadness. There are lots of differences between sadness and depression. For example, sadness is often triggered by a cause and is short term, and often you can make yourself feel better when you're feeling sad. So clinical depression is not just that feeling of sadness, although that does, consist of one of the symptoms. Clinical depression is a set of more complex symptoms that you have to show an awareness of. But most importantly, these symptoms must be causing distress or impaired functioning in social and or occupational roles for it to be considered clinical and for a person to be diagnosed with clinical depression. So this bottom bullet point might sound familiar to you in terms of defining abnormality and certainly the failing to function adequately definition. You might recognise some similarities between that and clinical depression, because of course depression is considered an abnormality. So you have to be able to understand the characteristics of depression, the behavioural, cognitive and emotional characteristics. So I'd like you to pause the video and I would like you to jot down any possible behavioural, emotional or cognitive characteristics for depression. So by emotional, we mean how might a person feel when they are in a depressed state. For behavioural, we mean what might a person do or how might they behave, so how might they act. And then for cognitive, what might a person think when they are suffering from depression. So there are 3 characteristics for each, so you'll end up with a total of 9 characteristics. So please pause the video and have a go, and in 5 seconds we'll examine the characteristics. Okay, so if we start with the emotional characteristics of depression, they consist of lowered mood. So as mentioned previously, it's not just feeling sad. The mood can be feeling empty and feeling worthless. Emotional of anger, feelings of anger and maybe hatred. Lowered self-esteem, so not liking themselves, talking sort of negative things about themselves, the way they look or the things that they do. So that idea of self-loathing, which means they might start to hate themselves, hate the way they speak, hate the way they dress, hate the way they talk, that sort of thing. How they talk, speak, dress, look is what I meant to say. And then behavioural, you've got changes in activity levels. Now this can be reduced, so feeling very lethargic, feeling like you've got a massive lack of energy, but also could be heightened. So psychomotor agitation is your key term there if you wanted to learn that, but the actual characteristic is just that it affects activity levels. So not being able to relax is what psychomotor agitation is. So like fiddling with something or pacing, walking around the room, not being able to sit down. Disruption to sleep and eating behaviours. So they might experience insomnia, which is a lack of sleep, or hypersomnia, where they oversleep, or they might eat a lot more, especially a lot more junk food and comfort eat, etc., or just not have an appetite and not feel like eating at all. Then you have to be careful not to confuse this behavioural characteristic with the emotional characteristic of anger. So they can feel angry, but then their behaviour could be that they are physically or verbally aggressive towards themselves or others, so self-harm or just actually physically or verbally harming other people, maybe snapping at people, or even being physically aggressive towards others. Then cognitive, the way they think, poor concentration, so not being able to cope with tasks or make decisions or stay focused for too long. Dwelling on the negative and ignoring the positive, so paying more attention to negative aspects of a situation, that whole glass half full rather than half empty metaphor. And then absolutist thinking, so that's your black or white, being very rigid in your thinking. Everything is either really good or really bad. There's no in between, there's no grey area, there's no middle ground. So those are your 9 characteristics for depression. I'll just wipe the screen to give you an opportunity to recap those if you feel like you need to. And we're going to move on to have a look at a scenario to finish the video with. For the final part of the video, you've got the opportunity to identify some behavioural, emotional and cognitive aspects of Jessica's situation. So if you just pause the video now, in 5 seconds, I will talk through some of the characteristics Jessica is displaying. Okay, so starting with behavioural, we can see she's lost quite a bit of weight, so there's been changes in her appetite and eating habits. She's also been staying up late into the night, so she's suffering from insomnia. Again, changes in her sleeping habits. Jessica is very sensitive when asked about this and snaps at her parents. Now that I'm going to do sort of half and half. If she's snapping at her parents, she's definitely displaying some anger, but she's also might be feeling anger. So that could be the behavioural characteristics of aggression, but also the emotional characteristic of anger. In one argument, she says she hates her parents and hates herself. So there is definitely some more emotional characteristics there of lowered self-esteem and maybe even lowered mood, so feeling worthless by hating herself. In another argument, she says that she did not enjoy being at university and hates visiting her family. That to me jumps out as absolutist thinking, as the cognitive characteristic in that idea that everything is bad. So she didn't enjoy university, she didn't enjoy family, so nothing's good. If she's away from her family at university, it's not good. If she's at home with her family, it's not good. Shows no enthusiasm about returning to university after the holiday. Again, another cognitive characteristic, but this time I would argue that is dwelling on the negative. And then finally, she's been unable to concentrate on a piece of coursework, which is your cognitive characteristic of poor concentration. I'm just going to go back and highlight because I've spotted that in another argument. So the fact that she's getting into those arguments is another behavioural characteristic of aggression. So there are lots of different routes that you could have gone down with that activity, but if you've identified at least one behavioural, emotional and cognitive aspect of Jessica, then that is enough to show the exam board that you can understand the different characteristics of depression. So that reaches the end of this video. Thank you for watching and I hope you found it useful.